Hi, this is Doug Schrift with the Suburban Walker. What do you do when a ping pong table falls down and hits you in the ankle? I'll show you next. Oh, that's better. So what do you do when you injure your ankle? Well, the first thing I did was go to the urgent care, get some x-rays, and get some pain medication. Nothing's broken, just a fairly good contusion from the ping pong table falling down on me. And what they recommend is what I recommend as a therapist all the time: rest, ice, compression, and elevation. You can remember it by RICE, and you've probably heard that before. R-I-C-E. Let me show you what it's like.
So we want to remember rest, ice, compression, and elevation. First we'll apply some compression with an ACE wrap, starting at the toes, and just give it a light pull, probably 40% of the stretchability, and you want to cover about 50% of the band every time you go around, starting from the toes. And keep following up. Remember to cover the wound if you have a wound. And sometimes the heel sticks out, and that's okay. And you want to continue past the ankle and up as high as you can around the leg. And if your band has clips, place the clips on. If you have Velcro, then just put the Velcro on. And then we have elevation, compression, and here's a little ice. And we're all set.
So that's my story. So next time a ping pong table falls down on your ankle, remember RICE: rest, ice, compression, and elevation. For the Suburban Walker, this is Doug Schrift. Join me as I rehab this ankle in our next adventures. See you then.